First of all, the Turkish politics is a largely nationalist politics. There is no non-nationalist political party in Turkey apart from the negligible Communist Party or Workers' Party. All relevant political parties are nationalist political parties. First of all, the CHP, the main opposition party, which was expected to somehow resist to the idea of cross-border operation, is a nationalist party. In fact, the anti-Kurdish sentiments belong to the CHP traditionally. The Kemalist policies of CHP has always been unitarian, one nation, one flag, one language, and so on. So any kind of suppression or oppression of Kurdish identity belongs intrinsically to the CHP. The MHP is by definition an ultra-nationalist party. Even the Kurdish party is a nationalist party, albeit being a nationalist party of an other ethnicity. Well, other minor parties are ethnic parties. Vatan Partisi, the Homeland Party, used to be an ultra left-wing party in the past. It converted itself into a nationalist party. So by definition, almost all political parties in Turkey has nationalist sentiments, but largely all of them has moved towards more nationalism recently. The Justice and Development Party was the only hope of minorities, ethnic minorities in Turkey, because being an Islamist party, it should have been more inclusive of all nations of Islam. But unfortunately, it is not. It has been hijacked by the nationalist sentiments of mainly MHP, and the whole country became nationalist, anti-Kurdish people. Well, first of all, Erdogan is a master of symbolism and creating new dictionary. Very recently, he turned back to the ultra-nationalist, Turkish ultra-nationalist dictionary terminology of red apple. Once he was asked by the journalist, where are you going? What is the target in this Syrian operation? And he responded, the target is Kızıl Elma, the red apple. Now, this term returns to the late 19th century ideologue of Turkish nationalism, Namık Kemal, who had a dream about red apple, connoting a unification of all Turkish-speaking nations. So it is a kind of Turanist, pan-Turkist ideology that is within a symbol. And it is amazing because traditionally Islamist politics in Turkey had always been critical of pan-Turkism because it is an alternative. In fact, an alternative thesis to pan-Islamism, which is largely used to be the ideology of Mr. Erdogan. On the other hand, he also started to utilize Quranic language. We are used to the use of or usurpation of terms like shaheed, martyr, or shahada, martyrdom, and so on in in cross-border conflicts. But Erdogan started to use eschatological literature, and he, for example, mentioned once that actually God promised success to himself. This resembles to Tony Blair speaking to God and entering into Iraq and so on. There's no premise in Islamic literature about that, but Islamic eschatology suggests a kind of revival of Islamic might and power at the end of the days, and Erdogan is actually referring to those traditions. And amazingly, the Turkish religious authority ordered 80,000 mosques all around Turkey to read a particular chapter in the Quran, which is named Fath, which refers to concurrence of an area. Let alone the Islamic understanding of what Fath, concurrence, means, which is rather a peaceful concept in Quranic terminology, the fact that the mosques were utilized and mobilized in support of the Turkish army does say that this is not a simple operation that will be kept within the area of Afrin, and this is not an operation about elimination or annihilation of terrorist threat to the Turkish sovereignty. It goes beyond that, and it has mythical elements in it. It has eschatological connotations in it. It certainly says a lot about the awaiting of the second coming of Messiah or the coming of Mahdi, its Islamic equivalent. First of all, it will certainly create a lot of displacement, internal displacement within Syria. Whether or not that displacement will move towards Turkish mainland and towards Europe later on is a question of whether Turkey will let it happen. The whole logic behind the Afrin operation is to prevent creation of a Kurdish strip between the Mediterranean and the Kurdish mainland in northern Iraq. So Turkey will do its utmost to prevent any kind of mobility, human mobility of the Kurdish people between Turkey and Syrian Kurdistan. So I assume that there will be mobility towards Iraqi Kurdistan, which actually was already hosting hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees. These were mainly Kurdish people from Syria. So the burden on Iraqi Kurdistan is going to get heavier and heavier. Of course, we have to ask the question whether Turkish operations will be kept only within Syrian borders, or Turkey is going to do similar things in Iraqi Kurdistan also, or not. If it does, then the mobility will most probably be towards Iran and other regional countries, including Jordan. Damascus has already made that clear, that this is breach of its own sovereignty, and they said that their air defense system is ready to down the Turkish air fighters and so on. But up until now, we didn't see any kind of action at the side of Assad regime. We have seen some missiles coming into cities like Reyhanlı and smaller provisional cities around Gaziantep, which is almost 40 kilometers from the border, and there had been casualties. Turkish citizens were killed because of these missiles. But it seems that these are not Syrian missiles; these are rather Kurdish operations. But still, it does say something. If the PYD is able to hit Turkish cities within the Turkish borders, certainly Syrian government will be in much better position to hit Turkish targets, if it does want to. My understanding is Damascus should be quite happy with what's happening there. This is about the logic of getting a much weaker Kurdish autonomy and Kurdish opposition within the future Syria. Future Syria is certainly going to be a kind of federation or a loose federation, and Assad regime is already prepared to speak about a kind of autonomy given to the Kurds. But of course, the weaker that autonomy is, the stronger the Assad regime will be. So I assume both the Russians and the Assad regime are quite happy that the dirty job is being done not by them, but the Turks. I cannot go till the point of suggesting that we will eventually see a Turkish Syrian Assad regime coalition emerge out of this offensive. In the end, Assad regime will certainly keep going on speaking that Turks actually entered into their own sovereignty zone and so on. We know the issue of Hatay, Antakya, that lasted for 4 or 5 generations between the two countries. In fact, that issue can also pop up in the future if and when the Assad regime, clarifies its control over the totality of Syria. But certainly, as I said, because of weakening of the Kurdish opposition, Assad is going to benefit from this. No other opposition groups will also try to emerge as an alternative opposition group. And we have to underline the army that is fighting with the Turkish forces is not only PYD. Yes, PYD is the main component of the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, but it includes also Arab tribes. And those Arab tribes, having seen the Turkish army in front of them, fighting to them, will certainly feel more inclined towards the regime instead of speaking to either the Turks or even to Russians and Americans, because I assume both the Kurds and their Arab allies are thinking that they are already betrayed by the Russians and by the Americans, because none are really doing anything to help them. I think the Russians have a clear and clever calculation here. First of all, they are trying to give a lesson to the Kurds that they cannot play a dual game between Americans and Russians. You are either a Russian ally or an American ally in the region. Well, the Kurds were effectively playing both sides. They were receiving ammunition and logistic aid from the Americans, and they were also supported by the Russians, and they were invited to the coalition meetings in Sochi to join the rebuilding of the future Syria by the Russians. So they were enjoying the support of both sides, but of course neither side was happy with that. The Americans wanted a loyal Kurdish army there, loyal only to the American interest, and the Russians wanted the same. I think both sides wants to give this message to the Kurdish side. You cannot, be the bride of two grooms. You have to play with either one of the sides, and the Kurdish authorities in the region will have to make their minds, and it is not going to be an easy decision for them, because they have ambitions about the future, which is not supported by neither one of these superpowers in the region. So both parties are actually giving a kind of green light by, I can say, blind eye treatment to what Turkey is doing. Both countries are also suggesting that Turkey shouldn't go far to the point of annihilating all the Kurdish opposition, because both Americans and the Russians want the Kurds to be a constitutive element of the future Syria, but not as strong as the Kurds would want to be. So Russians also, together with Bashar Assad, is hoping that the Turks is going to weaken the Kurdish opposition there, but also they are hoping that the Kurds are going to be pushed into the arms of the Russians altogether, because when the Kurds are looking at Turkey, most probably they do not see a Russian ally hitting and beating them. They are seeing a Western ally that is beating. Turkey has been using this rhetoric for some time now. Of course, whenever they say terrorists, they mean the militants of PYD and other opposition groups that Turkey does not want to work with, or they don't want to work with Turkey. To be frank, Turkey is also providing logistic aid to other opposition groups, and in the eyes of the Americans, they are the terrorists, like the Jabhatun Nusra, which used to be called like that. Now it is the frontier of Fatah al-Sham. So it depends on who is defining whom as a terrorist. Americans are providing logistics to the PYD fighters or the Syrian Democratic Forces. The question here is whether those logistics are usable in cross-border operations, whether they can be used against Turkish authority or not. Turkey is alarmed, understandably. The number of the fighters of PYD is estimated around 60,000 people. Well, Turkey had PKK at the peak of its might. PKK never had more than 10,000 fighters. So this is 6 times larger than PKK, and most probably they have stronger weapons like anti-tank weapons, which PKK never had. So this has turned Turkey's own PKK problem into an organized frontier army. So Turkey is going to stop this. Turkey's operation there is understandable, and I think Turkey is just trying to play to the future. It's not a criticism of the past. It is a kind of message to the future that the United States should not continue on collaborating with any other force, not necessarily only the Kurds, but any other force in the region. We have to underline the fact that we didn't come to this point suddenly. The Turks are looking at the recent independence referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan, and they remember the times that actually they unwillingly conceded to the American decision to create a no-fly zone in the north of Iraq back in 1991, and to create an autonomous zone for the Kurds in the region. Those times Turkey was given guarantee over guarantee that this wouldn't lead towards an independent Kurdistan in Iraq. It did. Yes, it is not yet independent, but the Kurdish authority that the Turks trusted most actually went to the referendum. This does say that any kind of similar autonomy, any kind of similar no-fly zone that will be created in the north of Syria will eventually, within 10 to 20 years, go to independence. And then it is going to be a strip of two Kurdistans on the south of Turkey, which will cut Turkey off from the rest of the Arab Muslim world. And Turkey will be, interestingly and ironically, dependent on the Kurds, its enemies, in order to reach to its larger Middle Eastern market. So it is understandable why Turkey is resisting to the calls of Western powers to stop or to turn back from Syria. This is going to continue, and Turkey is going to continue not only in Afrin, but most probably in Manbij and Idlib also.